Hello, my name is Bill Carrigan. I'm a professor of history at Rowan University, an institution I will mention just briefly at the end of our lecture today. I'm going to be discussing Franklin Roosevelt's statement when he signed what's today known as the GI Bill of Rights. Many historians, including myself, think it's one of the most important acts of legislation ever passed by the United States government. On June 22nd, 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which provided for key benefits for veterans that were expected to flood back into the United States after the end of World War II. To understand why Congress passed this transformative legislation, we actually must go back to the end of World War I. Now, in the early 1920s, many veterans after World War I had found themselves struggling for unemployment, to find employment, and also just to adjust to life in the United States. And in 1924, Congress did pass the bonus bill that agreed to provide funds for veterans based on days served. But there was a strange provision that the payments wouldn't actually begin until 1945. This was unsatisfactory to the veterans probably at the time, but it became deeply unsatisfactory to them once the Great Depression began in 1929. About 10,000 veterans marched on Washington, D.C., actually demanding early payments of the bonuses. And President Herbert Hoover, he ordered the military to disperse these veterans during their protest. And Franklin Roosevelt, of course, everyone else in the nation was watching when this happened, and he vowed that if ever he was in the same situation, he would certainly make a different decision and would find a way to support veterans better. So that's one factor. The equally important, I would say, to the bonus army, however, is this general feeling during World War II that the Great Depression might indeed return after the conflicts in Europe and Pacific were over. Even after kind of 8 years of Roosevelt's New Deal, unemployment had remained very stubbornly high, about 15% or so on the eve of kind of American entrance into World War I. It was, of course, the subsequent massive mobilization of soldiers and of war production factory workers that almost erased unemployment. And many Americans considered it a legitimate danger that that unemployment might return after the war was over. And so politicians on both sides of the aisle were concerned about what to do about this. It was actually Republican World War I veteran Harry Comrie who actually proposed the initial draft of what became the GI Bill of Rights, but Roosevelt certainly championed it, and in Congress, it was actually hotly debated at the time. It almost died in Congress because of the unemployment provision, which critics said would sap the desire of workers to even seek employment. But memories of the bonus army, with these general fears about the return of the Great Depression, they were enough to get the legislation passed and the bill sent to Roosevelt to sign. And of course, the statement outlining the provisions is the document that I selected for this. Now, I just want to mention in later years that critics of the GI Bill have certainly existed, and they are not have anything to do with the unemployment provision at the time. It has to do, in fact, with even though the GI Bill did not allow for discrimination based on race or gender, that in fact what happened in practice was that the bill was not implemented equally. In other words, African Americans and women often had a much harder time taking advantage of the provisions than did white men. And the reason for this was not to do with the bill itself, but with how it was implemented. For example, many colleges at the time did not allow African Americans to attend or women to attend. That's one example. Also, bankers and real estate agents prevented African Americans in many cases from being able to take advantage of other aspects of the GI Bill. And those critics have legitimate points about the GI Bill and must be understood if you want to assess its significance completely. But in the end, in the final analysis, the GI Bill was a massive expansion of veteran benefits by the federal government. I think officials did a smart thing by actually referring to it as the GI Bill of Rights and not the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, because that conveyed that, in fact, the federal government had this duty to provide for its veterans, that the bill's provisions were not handouts, but were benefits rightly won by brave service. The effort was, I think, very successful, and today the Servicemen's Readjustment Act is one of the most popular and successful pieces of legislation ever passed by Franklin Roosevelt, or indeed ever in the history of Congress. By 1956, the government had provided benefits for 10 million Americans. In 2017, the United States Congress passed something called the Forever GI Bill, making it clear of the enduring impact of this act of Congress passed in the midst of the worst war in world history. Now, let me conclude with that personal note that I mentioned. I teach at Rowan University. It was founded in 1923 as Glassboro State Teachers College. And I would argue that outside of the founding itself, the GI Bill is the second most important moment in the history of my university. It was an institution primarily devoted to providing education for those who wanted to become primary and secondary school teachers in the region. And in fact, enrollment had dipped to a low of 170 in 1943 as a result of World War II, but enrollment was in the hundreds in this first period. After the GI Bill was passed, veterans in the region seeking to go to college greatly expanded enrollment at the university, which changed its name to Glassboro State College, expanded its curriculum, and really led to a period of kind of very significant growth. In fact, without this growth that I think is attributed to the GI Bill, the other moments in Rowan University's history, which some might argue are very significant, would never have happened. And that the first is the 1967 summit between U.S. President Lyndon Johnson and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, one of our kind of most famous moments on the international stage. And then maybe even more importantly, in the 1990s, the decision of MIT graduate Henry Rowan to donate $100 million, and which led to the name change to Rowan University, although he did not insist upon on that name change. In any event, today, when I started in the late 1990s, Glassboro State College, then Rowan University, had 9,000 students. Today, we have over 20,000 students, 2 medical schools. The university is completely different than it had been. But I think if you want to look back and understand how Rowan University became what it is today, you have to go back to 1944 and the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. Thank you very much. Have a great day.